This video was made possible thanks to our wonderful supporters over on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/GameXplain and consider helping us out to deliver more content just like this. Kid Icarus Uprising is now 8 years old. To put some perspective into that, by the time the GameCube came out in 2001, the following games were 8 years old. Doom, Star Fox, Myst, Mortal Kombat 2, Secret of Mana, Mega Man X, Zelda Link's Awakening, and of course we can't forget the Super Mario Bros. Movie debuted in theaters. I struggle to call Uprising retro, but a lot can happen in 8 years. We recently covered Uprising as part of our Game Club series, essentially a game version of a book club where each week 4 members of the GameXplain crew play up to the same point in the same game and share in-depth thoughts every step of the way. Better yet, we're playing alongside you. Each recording is hosted live to our patrons who are able to chime in and join the discussion with their thoughts and perspectives as they play with us. We even had multiplayer matches where they absolutely dominated us. But considering not everyone has 7 hours to watch the whole series, we also have the retro review to consolidate my thoughts, but I am just one person. My thoughts don't represent everyone at GameXplain, and so we'll hear from Andre, Derek, and Ash later on in the review. Anyway, let's dive in. I did not grow up with Kid Icarus, and so my first exposure to the franchise was Pit's announcement in Smash Bros. Brawl. He was unlike any other Nintendo character I'd seen, and I wanted to find out more about him. When the Wii finally launched, I bought Kid Icarus on Virtual Console, and it was a snooze cruise. I tried Myths and Monsters, and likewise, these games just weren't for me. They were slow, clunky, frustrating, and just didn't resemble the badass angel I was anticipating in Brawl. Sakurai's Pit was a different character. When Brawl finally came around, we saw Sakurai re-envision everything about the world of Kid Icarus. Subspace cutscenes would even give us a look at a redesigned Lady Palutena and an early glance at how Sakurai saw Kid Icarus. Not as a slow vertical side-scroller, but a high-action game, and he was far from done. At E3 2010, Nintendo's next-generation handheld was finally shown to the public, the 3DS, and to debut it was the return of an old friend.
Sorry to keep you waiting!
The entire trailer was a self-aware celebration of a franchise that hadn't had a game in 20 years. But this clearly wasn't the same game, and I don't think many people cared. It wasn't necessarily the return of Kid Icarus that was exciting, it was the return of Sakurai's Pit. Uprising still pays homage to the original with its character and story, but the gameplay is something else entirely. When Mario jumped into 3D, a lot changed, but it was fundamentally still a platformer. Same with Zelda, perspective changed, but this was still Zelda. However, Kid Icarus went from being a platformer with light shooting elements to flat out being a third-person shooter, something Nintendo's first-party catalog did not have at the time of 3DS. 3DS was getting platformer after platformer, and this was such a breath of fresh air. Uprising's gameplay was split into 2 styles, air battles and land battles. And you've probably heard this a million times, but the air portions are exhilarating, whereas the land portions are divisive. While you're soaring through the air, it's like riding a meticulously crafted roller coaster. There's a sense of speed and scale you just don't get in many other games, let alone handheld games. It was crazy to go from this to this. Seeing Pit soar through the sky as he's dwarfed by a giant space pirate ship, seeing him dodge dozens of incoming lasers as the 3D effect dives into your eyes, and picking up on the visual story by seeing humans fight a war below you is when Uprising wows. It's insane this was pulled off on 3DS. And at first, the controls are simple. Much like Sin and Punishment on the Wii, all you can do is move, aim, and shoot. And when in the sky, this simplicity works remarkably well. It's still not exactly what I would call intuitive, and we'll get into that more a bit later, but it provides a form of flexibility we wouldn't see otherwise. The sky provides some of the most high-energy experiences I've ever had from Nintendo, and it's backed up by its surrounding pillars. Uprising's core foundation comes down to 3 different groups, the 3 S's: shooting, spectacle, and story. These all happen simultaneously, so while you're soaring through the air and ripping through everything in your path, the characters are constantly talking back and forth, the entire time. Sometimes the narration is married with what's going on screen, and this can lead to set pieces, like there's a moment where Pit clambers up a giant wall, and frankly without the narration, this is boring, like let's turn it off a moment. It just feels like there's so much dead air and it's really jarring without it. And other times it's used to deliver story without taking control away from the player. Uprising has very few cutscenes because the story is mostly happening in the gameplay. This is a very different game for Nintendo, but that's such a Nintendo move. For me, and I'm sure most people, these pillars hold up strongest during flight, where everything is highly controlled and curated. I was able to enter a zen-like state while flying through the sky, and even when there were dozens of lasers and explosions on screen, I could still manage to take in the story, though this wasn't always the case in my colleagues' experience. The sky is simply where Uprising works best, so let's talk about land. Land battles borrow the same pillars of shooting, story, and spectacle, but it's a jarring transition to go from the bombastic, choreographed flight sections to walking around on land. What was once a simple control scheme becomes something far less ideal, and while it serves its purpose and functionality, it comes at the cost of comfort. When on land, not only are you controlling the cursor, but also the camera, so you kind of flick the screen.
It's like spinning a globe and stopping it with your finger.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Now, this admittedly offers a sense of speed and precision in a similar vein to a mouse or gyro, but it's in no way as natural as those two. If Uprising coming with a stand wasn't a red flag to questionable comfort, then I don't know what to tell you. People often joke this is a game for a three-handed person, and it's kinda true. Over the years I've adapted to kind of balancing the 3DS on my knee, and while that works pretty well, the fact you have to find your own remedy is part of the problem. Like, I play fine with it on my knee, but saying it out loud makes me sound a bit crazy. Now, this is somewhat overcome by the goddess powers, which are exclusive on-land abilities. These range from automatically targeting enemies to shooting giant lasers. I played well over 50 hours of Uprising's multiplayer back in the day where these are a must, so personally I use these a lot in the story, whereas my colleagues barely touch them, and I can't blame them. They're rarely incentivized, and while they certainly can speed up combat, having to stop what you're doing to flick through the touchscreen and find the one you want is certainly not ideal. It doesn't really feel balanced in the story either. I played on level 5 difficulty for most of the game, and Mega Laser would demolish the majority of bosses and undermine a lot of their gimmicks. The fights were over so quickly that I couldn't hear their conversations, and that sucks! It goes beyond control though. Flight sections are so stunning, so fast, so frantic, and then you land and suddenly Pit feels weaker. It takes more shots to down the same enemies, you can't run for more than a few seconds without losing your breath, and that high-octane action just kinda grinds to a halt. The pacing is drastically different, and while there's still some good sides to the on-foot sections, it's certainly not as accessible. There's still a good amount of highlights, but they're not as frequent. For instance, the room where the ground's invisible when you guide yourself using the reflections in the mirror, that's fantastic. And I love the level that extends the flight battle with the Hydra heads into an on-ground hunt. And then there's that level where you're being hunted and sniped by Dark Pit. These are all excellent, but with some exceptions, the on-foot portions just kind of blend together for me. I can recall amazing moments in the sky, like Poseidon parting the sea and Pit being shot into space, but those instances are so much rarer elsewhere. It could get to the point where certain levels could feel flat out unnecessary. Uprising unfortunately has some story padding. Without going into spoilers, right before you face down against the final boss, the momentum screeches to a halt and you're sent on a quest to fetch a weapon to fight with. All the momentum is just gone. Likewise, there's an act in the game that drags on for far too long without really much development. The gameplay does remain somewhat at the quality you'd expect, but given the story is a key pillar of Uprising's formula, it really can drag the enjoyment down. There's easily 3 or maybe even more chapters I would slice from the game, and I think it'd be better for it. It's a shame because the story is otherwise excellent, it just chases its tail a few too many times. But this is one of the few times Nintendo have worked with union voice actors, and they bring everything to life. There's consistent and enjoyable character growth over each chapter, and even Pit, who's otherwise a simple yes man, has moments of genuine emotion and change. Yet these chapters slow it all down. I certainly have points to criticize about Uprising, but when it's good, it's so good. This is probably my favorite cast of Nintendo characters, and when the pillars are holding up strong, Uprising is up there with my favorite Nintendo games. Further to that, Uprising has Sakurai's obsessive attention to detail. There's a point in the game where the entire menu hub changes for just like 2 chapters. As in like everything! The entire UI changes and even certain options are redesigned to match circumstances of the story. Who does that? It's so cool! There are Smash-style trophies, a crazy list of weapons that you can find and fuse, and more side modes than are probably needed. Like, this game came with a pack of AR cards. You never need to use them, but they're there. In my opinion, this is one of the most ambitious games Nintendo's ever made, and it's more than just complete. It feels like 3 sequels packed into one, and then it also has a multiplayer component that extends off your progress from elsewhere in the game. I played a lot of Uprising's multiplayer back in the day, and maybe that's because there's nothing else quite like it on a handheld. It's essentially Nintendo's online shooter before Splatoon, but it relies on traditional arena-style death matches. The twist is here though, you can use any weapon or goddess power that you accumulate from the main game. But the stronger you arm yourself, the bigger target you have on your head. If you go in with a weak loadout, people get less points for taking you down. But likewise, if you get something that's really overpowered, someone else might win just by killing you 2 or 3 times. Now, I typically hate loadouts in games, and while I think there's still a lot of refining that can be done here, it's a great idea, especially in Uprising's unique team mode, Light vs Dark. Here, both teams have a health bar, but the same point values apply. So if someone with a terrifyingly strong weapon is taken down, you'll pretty much deplete the other team's gauge in just one fell swoop. Where it gets interesting though, is once that bar depletes, one player becomes Pit or Dark Pit, and the game won't end until that player is taken down, or the time ends. Now this offers some of the best moments of Uprising's multiplayer. Suddenly it's not an aggressive free-for-all, but rather a hunt for that one player as they attempt to hide in the shadows. For me, multiplayer is LAN battles at their best. A lot of the same problems do still apply, but you're far more incentivized to use your goddess powers to simply stand a chance, and the open areas work so much better with the controls than the otherwise linear corridors in the campaign. But while I mostly praise the weapon point system, it doesn't quite work. When playing with patrons, we were completely dominated by certain players who just took us all out with no trouble at all. Like yeah, their weapons were worth a lot, but we couldn't even touch them. The balance works better on paper than it does in action. I wish there was some option to have everyone fight with the same weapon, because otherwise it can get rather chaotic and sometimes unbalanced. If Uprising ever sees a re-release, I think there's a lot they can tighten up online because this foundation works really well. It just needs some more balancing, more modes, and a few more options. All in all though, I like Kid Icarus Uprising a lot. I clearly have enough negative things to say about it, but the good parts hold it up so high that even the lesser moments don't do much to detract from my overall enjoyment. The on-foot controls do put a damper on the experience, but once you grow accustomed to them, they do add a sense of speed and agility that button controls simply wouldn't match, though it comes at the cost of accessibility. But that's just what I thought. What about the rest of the GameXplain crew? Derek, seeming as this is your very first time playing, take it away.
I'm honestly amazed at how well Kid Icarus Uprising holds up after all this time. It's still a technical marvel on the 3DS and one of the best showcases of the 3D. It also has charm to spare with jokes that consistently made me smile and laugh. These are wonderful characters new and old that finally give Kid Icarus a personality, perhaps Nintendo's best. Unfortunately, the controls are always going to be an issue. While great for the air segments, the on-foot feels hampered and cramped. I was eventually able to find a comfortable position and enjoy myself, but it's a learning curve that many won't bother with. That said, the game is constantly throwing new scenarios at you, and while not all of them land, I was consistently entertained throughout. There's a reason fans keep begging for a port or sequel, and I'm right there with them. I like it a lot.
And what about you, Ash?
Much like the nature of the relationship between Pit and Palutena, Kid Icarus Uprising is an enigma. If GameXplain used a traditional 1 to 10 rating scale, there are certainly issues with the game for which I could objectively dock so-called points. The on-ground controls remain Uprising's central problem 8 years later and are a major sticking point despite the myriad ways you can customize them. The story has a few chapters that feel like filler, and the multiplayer often feels half-baked and too chaotic, especially when playing free-for-all matches. And yet there is just so much to love despite these shortcomings. Kid Icarus Uprising dares to break the Nintendo mold with an uncharacteristically anime, over-the-top cinematic quality to its presentation, almost as if you're playing Star Fox 64 turned up not to 10, but 15. The game pulls you into its world with its undeniable charm, then keeps you there with a playful edge and smart, punchy dialogue that make you care about its stellar cast of characters, especially when things turn dark later in the game. Add to that an exceptional soundtrack and a visual flair unlike anything else on the 3DS, not to mention some of the handheld's best stereoscopic 3D effects, and you've got a delicious recipe for a game I love that might be even tastier than Pit's beloved floor ice cream. If I were to give Kid Icarus Uprising a numerical score, it would not be a 10, but that's the beauty of GX's feelings-based review system. We embrace the fact that it is possible to love a demonstrably flawed game, and such is the case for me with Kid Icarus Uprising. It's far from perfect, but I still adore it despite that, and that's just as true today as it was in 2012. I can say with certainty it's a game I will always remember as one of my very favorites on the 3DS.
And finally, Andre, what do you think?
Hey, I'm the guy that gave Kid Icarus Uprising 3 out of 5 stars. So, do I still hate it 8 years later? Well, my first impression was that the game holds up incredibly well. I've said before that Kid Icarus Uprising is basically Nintendo's Uncharted when it comes to the quality of its presentation, and I stand by it. The voice acting is great, shout out to Hades, the script is clever and well written, and the flying segments in particular feature some truly astonishing visuals. The fact that it exists on the 3DS makes it all the more impressive. On the other hand, the on-ground segments continue to feel a bit clumsy, especially when it comes to dash attacks and selecting powers. Though I have softened a bit on the parts that annoyed me before. Even the controls weren't as painful as I remembered, though that might be because I was playing in the more spacious new 3DS XL. My biggest issue these days is that, outside of the flying segments, I just didn't find the core gameplay to be all that engaging, leaving it to the stellar presentation and fun character interactions to pull me through those sections. But I do appreciate the game kept surprising me around almost every corner. Being turned into a ring and playing as a dog still stands out in my mind. So, nearly a decade later, I like Kid Icarus Uprising, but I love Hades.
But what about all of you? If you were playing alongside us, what do you think of Kid Icarus Uprising today? Does it hold up? Let us know in the comments below, and of course be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for a lot more on Kid Icarus and future game clubs and other things gaming too. Until next time, bye.